Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Dr. Downey, or you can refer to me as Nick in this video. This is part 2 to our Q&A video. And just as a disclaimer, the answers that I'm giving are based on personal knowledge, and I might make a few mistakes. If I do make a mistake, please correct me in the comments down below. And remember, none of this is medical advice. I'm just giving you my answer as a friend. But with all that out of the way, let's move on with the video. So our first question is there a higher risk of health issues if starting your first testosterone cycle and deca cycle at the age of 45, like regaining natural hormone levels post-cycle? So I'll answer the second part to this question, which is quite commonly asked, and it's about returning back to baseline in terms of natural testosterone, LH-FSH, after a cycle. And it's commonly thought that when you get older, the ability to recover might be more difficult. From what I've seen in the data, anyone under the age of 65 should recover without many issues. But it's important to remember when you are aging, you go through a process of senescence, and with this, your testosterone levels decline. So your baseline after a cycle is going to be lower than it would have been if you were younger, let's say. But your ability to recover should more or less be the same if you are under the age of 65 according to our research. But if you have lower LH and FSH levels to begin with, suppression of these should return to normal once the exogenous compound is removed. Some might argue with a failing pituitary, as does happen with aging, that causing further suppression to it might make it a bit more difficult to recover or take a bit longer to recover because it's already older. However, as I mentioned, if you're under the age of 65, the ability to recover should be fine, but just remember your baseline levels won't be as high as they were if you were younger. But what I thought was interesting about this question is the first part, which spoke about having higher risks of health effects when you are older and about to run a cycle. And the reason for this is quite logical. People will say your body's older, so it can't really handle the stress of steroids as well. But I just want to give a bit of an example for why heavy steroid cycles might be a problem when you're older. And that's because we can look at something like the aging process of arterial blood vessels. As you age, they become less elastic, so blood pressures do increase slightly. And the problem is when you introduce an agent or run a cycle, your blood pressure is known to increase during a cycle. And if your blood vessels aren't able to compensate for that with their elasticity, the rise in blood pressure would be higher than someone who was younger than you with elastic arterial vessels. There are many examples that I could give, but essentially, yes, there are higher health risks when running a steroid cycle at an older age, and that's mostly due to your body not being able to handle the stress as well as a 25-year-old body. So the next question is, do testosterone levels return to normal after a 10-week steroid cycle? I've referred to this study many times. It's the Haarlem study that was performed in the Netherlands, and they found that with or without a PCT, pretty much everyone's testosterone levels return back to normal within a certain period. But again, your ability to recover does depend on your own body, your testicle health, your pituitary health, and if those are all fine, your testosterone levels should return to normal after a 10-week steroid cycle. Obviously, it depends on the dose and duration of the steroid that is used, but in general, yes, they do. So this question is quite interesting, and it is, what are the most dangerous steroids and the safest ones to use? So I have made a video on the top 5 worst steroids to use, and I recommend you watch that video. So I'll just briefly mention some dangerous steroids, but a big one that's up there is trenbolone, obviously, and that's mostly due to its effects that extend beyond just that of androgenicity and anabolic ability. It interferes with many different hormonal systems and results in worsening of mental health. Now, I do know some people say they don't get this from tren, but in general, when running a tren cycle, it's quite common to see a bit of liver enzyme disturbances as well as kidney changes. That paired onto the fact that it spikes your heart rate and blood pressure. So I'd say it's one of the more dangerous steroids. There are many other. Most steroids are dangerous, I guess you could say. None are technically safe to use, but it also depends on the dosage you use it at. So if you were to use something like TRT, there's a lot of data that would show its safety, but it still has data to show that it has side effects, such as raising your hematocrit. But if that isn't an issue, it's fairly safe and doesn't change cardiovascular outcomes. So I would say that's probably one of the safest steroids to use, but it also depends on the dose. If you're going to run super therapeutic amounts of testosterone, we do have studies that show up to 600 milligrams a day doesn't really do much to the body when used in a short duration. It does decrease HDL and increase LDL and causes slight increases in blood pressure. But I would say anything above 600 is probably stretching the definition of safe a bit, and testosterone becomes a bit more unsafe in that context. But as a general rule of thumb, going for something that is bioidentical, and I'm sure everyone's heard this, is probably safest just because it's more predictable, and testosterone has a lot of research to back it up. Other safe steroids could possibly include primobolan, but the issue with primobolan is there aren't as many studies on it as there are with testosterone. There are studies present, and what we know from it, primobolan, is that it does skew your lipids quite a bit, more so than testosterone does. And that could be due to the dose that it's used at. Some might argue Masteron could be safe. I'd say using anabolic dosages of Masteron, whilst it's not going to cause too many issues, it again skews your lipids and causes hair loss, acne, and a big one, which is prostate issues. Benign prostatic hyperplasia isn't necessarily life-threatening unless you get something like urinary retention. It doesn't necessarily develop into prostate cancer, but it causes issues with quality of life. And a lot of people will tell you that when they were on something like Masteron, they noted they were peeing more often, they couldn't void their bladder completely, and that's just a sign that perhaps it's not that safe, but it is a drier compound, so increases in blood pressure aren't that drastic. Possibly another safe steroid could be Proviron. Again, it's similar to Masteron, and the dosages used with Proviron are usually a lot lower, which is why it probably has quite a lot of data to support its safety. So I guess you can see where I'm coming from this. It really depends on the dose you're using, but since Proviron is a DHT derivative, it can cause similar issues to that of Masteron when used at higher dosages. Now, you'll probably notice I haven't mentioned any oral steroids, and the reason for that is you can't really classify any oral steroid as safe. It also depends on your definition of safe. And the major issue is that whilst we do have safer orals, such as Anavar, which has a lot of clinical data, you can't use Anavar for long durations, and the reason for that is liver toxicity, which isn't the major concern. It's the fact that it really skews your lipids, more so than injectables do, and all orals have this issue, which is why I don't classify them as safe. And the problem with this alteration in cholesterol is that oral steroids, whilst causing issues to the liver, kind of impact your body's ability to create antioxidants, and it increases the risk of lipid peroxidation or oxidation, correct me if I'm wrong, and this just puts you at further risk of cardiovascular disease. But in summary, my top 3 choices for safest compounds would probably be testosterone being number 1, and something like Primo and possibly Masteron, but none of them are completely safe. They all have issues. Our next question is, which steroids have little to no adverse reaction? So I kind of touched on this in the previous answer. So adverse reactions are kind of individualized. From a acute healthcare kind of standpoint, changes in cholesterol, liver enzymes, kidney function are all part of adverse reactions that I actively look out for, but an important one that I don't look at enough is suppression, and that obviously is an adverse reaction. So we have something like testosterone, which is, as I stated, one of the safer compounds because of the research we have behind it, but testosterone is suppressive. Whereas if you look at orals, they have adverse reactions like I mentioned, but they might not be as suppressive. I pin this down to the half-life of these steroids, which is why I've kind of become in favor of shorter acting testosterone because it is testosterone, which I deem as relatively safe, and it doesn't cause as much suppression as a longer acting ester. I made a video on this. So in my opinion, there's no steroid that has little to no adverse reactions, although I could argue that testosterone, besides potential suppressive effects, probably when used at a therapeutic dose, probably has little to no adverse reactions, but that doesn't mean they can't occur. Our next question is, what is better for TRT, testosterone enanthate or undecanoate? So the answer to this question, as with most of my answers, is it's very individualized. That's because in the case of a male older the age of 65 who requires TRT, I'd probably go with undecanoate, and that's because it's been demonstrated not to have adverse effects on hematocrit and doesn't seem to skew lipids as much. We have data to demonstrate that testosterone undecanoate has similar safety to transdermal testosterone. So the benefit of it is that it doesn't raise your hematocrit as much. And that's mostly due to the fact that it never really peaks. So you never get acute stimulation of EPO and more production of red blood cells. But because it never peaks, some younger individuals don't enjoy it as much. And because it has such a long half-life and injection frequency is not that often, and some might fall into a low normal range before the next injection, testosterone enanthate becomes a bit more favorable. I'd go with testosterone cypionate over enanthate just purely based on post-injection pain, but they're more or less similar. But in the context of you not having raised hematocrit to testosterone, and if you're a younger individual, I find that these peaks that testosterone enanthate grants you, whilst can cause issues with estrogen, tend to be more favored by younger individuals, but there's no real data to support that. The ideal thing for TRT would be to mimic how your body produces testosterone, and that's that it is quite pulsatile, so lots of injections of short-acting esters or oral administration might better replicate that of your natural testosterone production, but the issue is frequent administration leads to poor adherence, and not a lot of people are going to follow that approach.